So let's now talk about the rules in relation to your RA 9344 on how we are going to handle CICLs. So please do remember that RA 9344 is your Juvenile Justice Welfare Act of 2006. Bago tayo nagkaroon ng RA 9344, what we have is what you call your PD 603. Yung PD 603 natin, yun yung tinatawag ninyo Child and Youth Welfare Code, PD 603 yun. Ngayon, it was passed during the time of President Marcos. So dahil hindi ganon ka-effective yung PD 603, they now introduced RA 9344. Under RA 9344, ito na yung Juvenile Justice Welfare Act ninyo, di ba? Dito, you are considered as a child if you are under 18. Ibig sabihin, in this law, the age of emancipation is 18. The age of majority is 18. Doon sa PD 603, ang age of majority or age of emancipation was 21. Okay? So, 21 ang age of emancipation, kailan? Or under what law? PD 603. Pag under 9344, anong age of emancipation or majority? That would be 18. So, please do remember na RA 9344 took effect May 20, 2006. Yun nga lang, yung implementing rules and regulations niya came later noong September 19, 2006. So, kailan siya naging fully effective talaga? September 19, 2006. Kasi doon lang naging effective yung implementing rules and regulations niya. Now, so let's now talk about the rules concerning your CICL. Ang iisipin nyo lang dito, it is almost similar to your criminal justice system. Yun nga lang ito, JJS, Juvenile Justice System. So, although almost similar sila, you would notice na merong iba sa process pag juvenile or pag CICL ang involved. What I would do now is just to give you an overview. Yung specific discussions ng topics na to would be provided later. Okay, so overview lang muna tayo. Ang unang step na mangyayari dyan would be the taking of a CICL into custody. Kung adult sana yan, you call that an arrest, but because we are talking about a minor, we are talking about a CICL, instead of calling it an arrest, ang tawag natin dito is initial contact. Upon the conduct of an initial contact, so andyan na ngayon yung minor sa custody ng police, right? Yung police na yan, magkakandak sila ng initial investigation. By the way, upon the happening of the initial contact, the law enforcers now are required by law to call 3 people. Sino yung tatlong yan? You have the parent or the guardian or the nearest relative. Number 2, you now have your local social welfare development officer. And of course, the third one, you now have a lawyer. So, upon the conduct of initial contact, kailangan yung law enforcers having custody over the child must already contact these 3 people. Kasi, the initial investigation would involve what you call an interview. And take note, the interview could not happen if these 3 people are not present. So, upon the conduct of initial contact, kailangan makontak ngayon ng law enforcers yung tatlong personalities that I have mentioned, and then they would be proceeding with your initial investigation. In the initial investigation, your law enforcers now would try to determine if indeed there was a crime and whether this child really had a participation in said crime. Aside from that, they would also try to determine if this person is really a child. Okay? So, andyan yan. Initial investigation, typical investigation yan. Now, after that, magkakaroon ng preliminary investigation. Of course, who would do that? That would be done by the so-called prosecutor. Always remember na pag CJS sana to, because the person is already under custody, what should be conducted is an inquest proceeding. But because we are now talking about a CICL, yung prosecutor natin, whether the child is under custody or not, ang gagawin niya is a preliminary investigation. Okay? Now, in in case Mr. Prosecutor was able to determine na, oops, there is probable cause, anong mangyayari? He would now file the case to the court. Anong ipa-file niya? He is going to file an information. If you could still remember, your prosecutor initiates a criminal action by the filing of the so-called information, right? Ano na ulit yung information? Sabi natin before, or sabi sa inyo in your CJS, is that an information is an accusation in writing charging a person with an offense subscribed by the prosecutor. Pinafile niya yan if there was a determination of probable cause through preliminary investigation. So now, pag na-file na yung information sa court, possible na magkaroon ng diversion if allowed siya. Okay, ma'am, ano ba yung requirement ng diversion? We are going to talk about it later. Or maybe the child now would be released on temporary liberty under bail. Yung bail niya, pwede siyang in the form of cash bond, property bond. You now have your recognizance or corporate surety. Pero of course, because that person is a minor, ang expectation natin, most probably recognizance yan. Or maybe worst case scenario, this person now would be detained inside the so-called Youth Detention Center. Ngayon, we call it your bahay pag-asa. So, kunyari, hindi nag-work yung diversion o di naman kaya, palpak siya, right? So, what would happen? You would now proceed with your arraignment kasi yung suspended na juvenile proceedings matutuloy na siya. So, you now have what you call the conduct of an arraignment. If you could still remember, arraignment is the reading of a case in open court to inform the accused of the nature and cause of accusation. During your arraignment, dalawa ang nangyayari. Diba? There would be the reading of the complaint or information, and you also have the entry of plea. After arraignment, they would conduct a pre-trial. Pre-trial now is the simplification of the issues of the case. After pre-trial, magkakaroon ng trial. So what happens during trial? You now have the determination of the merits of the case. How? Through the presentation of evidence. The moment the court is already satisfied with the evidences provided, the court now is ready to promulgate judgment. So he would now say if the child is guilty or maybe not guilty. Now, there are cases whereby the court would allow what you call a suspension of sentence. Pero pag-uusapan natin yan later pa. Or if not naman, the person now pay his penalty. The judgment now would be promulgated, tapos he might be allowed probation. Possible na mag-undergo siya ng probation depending on the circumstances of the case. Or worst case scenario, he would have to serve his sentence in a youth rehabilitation center. Okay, so overview lang yan guys. Isa-isahin natin sila for better understanding. So let's now talk about your initial contact. There are two ways to do it. The first one is via the taking of a child into custody by a law enforcer or by a private individual. I repeat, what is the first way to conduct an initial contact? That would be via the taking of a child into custody by a law enforcer or maybe by a private individual. There's no problem if the person conducted initial contact is a law enforcer. Why? Kasi, in such cases, they can easily proceed with initial investigation. Saan nagkaka-problem? There is a problem if the person who conducted the initial contact is a private individual. Ma'am, bakit nagkakaroon ng problem? Kasi, required ng law si private individual to deliver the CICL to the law enforcer for the conduct of initial investigation. So in order to comply with that, a private individual who conducts initial contact is mandated by law to deliver the child to the nearest police station. Okay? Pag private individual, anong requirement ng law natin? He needs to deliver the child to the nearest police station. Ma'am, bakit? So that the so-called law enforcers would be able to conduct what you call an initial investigation. Yun yung first way. Yung second way on how to conduct initial contact is via receipt of the CICL of the subpoena or summons from the prosecutor's office. I repeat. Ano yung second way to have initial contact? That would be via receipt of the CICL of a subpoena or summons from the prosecutor's office. So if the CICL receives a subpoena or maybe summons, ano ang sabi? There is already initial contact. Ma'am, what do you mean by subpoena? Ang isipin ninyo, a subpoena is an order issued by the court for the production of evidence. What is a subpoena? It is an order issued by the court for the production of evidence. On the other hand, pag sinabi naman nating summons, your summons would refer to an invitation for a person to appear in court. It is an invitation for a person to appear in court. So, pag yung bata naka-receive siya ng subpoena or maybe ng summons, anong sabi? That is already equivalent to initial contact. So, I repeat there are two ways to have initial contact. Number one, that would be the taking of a child into custody by a law enforcer or a private individual. Pag private individual yan, he needs to deliver the child to the nearest police station. Or maybe number two, ano ang sabi? Via receipt of the CICL of a subpoena or summons from the prosecutor's office. Ano ang meron dyan? That is what you call initial contact. Next. So, pag-usapan natin yung procedure for the taking of a CICL into custody. So, ano yung procedure natin? Ito, papakinggan nyo lang siya tapos pwede nyo siyang basahin ulit kasi provided naman siya ng law. Magkwentuhan lang tayo for this part. Take note, in conducting an initial contact or in taking a child into custody, as a law enforcer, you need to identify yourself as a law enforcer to that CICL. Ma'am, how would I identify myself? Ang gagawin mo is that you are going to present proper identification. So, possible that you show him your ID, o di naman kaya, you show him your badge. Okay? For them to know who you are, and for him to know na, okay, you have authority to do so. The moment the child is already taken into custody, you need to immediately notify these three personalities. I repeat upon the conduct of initial contact, you need to notify these three personalities. Number one, you have there the parent or the guardian or the nearest relative. I repeat, number one na dapat mong i-notify, parent or guardian or nearest relative. What's the second one? You also need to notify the LSWDO, so si Local Social Welfare Development Officer. Sino yung pangatlo? You now have a lawyer. Most often than not, ang tinatawag nilang lawyer is yung galing sa PAO. Kasi it's for free tapos they are immediately available. So upon the conduct of initial contact, the law enforcers are required by law to notify these three personalities within 8 hours from the initial contact. So within 8 hours from the initial contact, kailangan ma-notify itong tatlong taong to. Ma'am, bakit kailangan silang ma-notify? Kasi, take note, the law enforcers are only allowed to have this child under custody for not more than 8 hours. Ibig sabihin, how long can they have this child under custody? Maximum na yung 8 hours. They cannot go beyond 8 hours. Ibig sabihin, everything that they wanna do, everything that they wanna know from the child, kailangan malaman nila yon within 8 hours. Kasi, after the lapse of 8 hours, what would happen? This child now should be turned over to the proper person. So, kailangan magkaroon ng turnover. Okay? The child staying in the custody of the law enforcers should not exceed 8 hours. Sagad na 8 hours na yan. Hindi nga kagaya sa mga adults. Di ba for adults, you can detain the person depending on the gravity of the crime committed. Doon ngayon pumapasok yung 12-18-36. Dahil CICL to, dahil minor to, we do not follow that rule. Ang rule natin for a CICL, 8 hours lang. You cannot go beyond 8 hours. Kaya nga, because of that fact, kailangan i-notify mo itong 3 taong to within 8 hours. Ma'am, bakit? Kasi, yung law enforcers ninyo, if they would conduct initial investigation, they would have to conduct an interview of the child. And take note, the child cannot be interviewed without the presence of these 3 personalities. Kahit nga isa lang ang kulang eh. 3 yan na required. Kahit isa lang ang kulang dyan, the interview is considered as invalid. So they need to be notified kasi the interview should be conducted within this 8 hours. Kasi after 8 hours, kailangan ma-turn over na yung bata. Okay? Now, dun sa initial contact ninyo, you need to explain to the child in a language understood by him the reason for your apprehension, the crime he allegedly committed, and of course, his constitutional rights. So you need to tell the child in a language na naiintindihan niya yung reason for the apprehension, the crime na allegedly kinumit niya, tapos yung constitutional rights niya. Okay? Similar din doon sa adults natin. So pag okay na yan, ang iisipin ninyo, kailangan malaman na rin or kailangan i-determine ng law enforcer natin, ni arresting officer natin, kung ano ba yung age ng bata. Okay? Ma'am, bakit ganon? Kasi, there is always a presumption of minority. The minor is presumed as a minor unless proven otherwise. So, if the law enforcer is unable to prove that itong taong to, hindi na talaga siya minor, ang presumption, minor siya. Okay? Based on how the person looks, based on how he behaves, yung mga ganong aspects. Okay? Now, maliban dyan, pag nagkaroon tang initial contact, the law enforcer, the arresting officer, must immediately allow the child to undergo a thorough physical and mental examination. So, kailangan magkaroon ng medical exam. Ma'am, bakit? It's not only for the protection of the child, but rather, it would be more for the protection of the arresting officer. Ma'am, bakit? Kasi, if the child does not undergo medical examination, ang presumption ng law natin, anumang injuries ng batang yan, nakuha niya while the child is under the custody of the law enforcers. Okay? So, ganun ha. Kailangan yung law enforcers, they allow the child to undergo a thorough physical and mental examination. Okay? Now, anong sabi natin? 8 hours lang pwedeng hawakan ni law enforcer yung CICL. Bakit? Kasi after 8 hours, that child should be turned over to the proper person. Now, question, kanino ka magte-turn over? Yung turnover natin, ibe-base ninyo sa age. Mamaya natin pag-uusapan yan, okay? So, bastang iisipin ninyo ha, the law enforcement, upon conduct of initial contact, is given 8 hours to find out whatever they wanna find out. They're only given 8 hours to have this child under custody kasi after 8 hours, what would happen? The child needs to be turned over to the concerned person. Okay? So, ganun lang siya. By the way, please do not forget na pag nagkaroon ng initial contact, ang search ng bata, okay, yung frisking ng bata should be done by an officer of the same gender. So, pag babae, babae, pag lalaki, lalaki. Okay? So, initial contact. Now, so after the initial contact, what would happen? Magkakaroon tayo ng initial investigation. Initial investigation is a typical kind of investigation conducted by law enforcers. Okay? Same din lamang sa adults, yun nga lang dito, the subject now or the suspect is actually a CICL. Take note. Initial investigation is a stage which immediately follows initial contact. Ma'am, anong nangyayari dito? Your law enforcers now would be taking the statement of the CICL. Ma'am, question. Can any police officer conduct the initial investigation? The answer is no. The initial investigation should always be conducted by a police officer or by a law enforcer coming from your WCPD, diba? Yung Women and Children Protection Desk ninyo. Yun kasi yung unit na in charge pag meron tayong mga CICL. Ma'am, bakit ganun? Kasi the people composing this office were actually trained on how to handle CICL. Okay? So, ganyan ang rule natin for your initial investigation. Now, ang iisipin ninyo, if you are going to question the child, I repeat, if you are going to question the child, you need to make sure that the questioning, yung interview ninyo, yung investigation na yan, should only be conducted in the presence of, sabi natin kanina, yung tatlo. You now have the parent or guardian or nearest relative, LSWDO, or maybe yung lawyer. Now, if you are going to look at it, ma'am, di ba meron yung mga locality na wala silang LSWDO? Ma'am, di ba meron yung mga instances na yung bata hindi taga dyan sa lugar na yan, kaya wala yung parent, guardian, or nearest relative niya. In such cases, the law allows what you call a substitute. Pero take note, sino lang ang pwedeng i-substitute ninyo, number 1 and number 2. Doon sa tatlong in-enumerate natin, sino lang ang pwedeng ma-substitute? You now have the parent, guardian, or nearest relative, tapos si LSWDO. Sino hindi pwedeng ma-substitute? You cannot substitute the so-called lawyer. Okay? Hindi siya pwedeng ma-substitute. Walang proxy-proxy pag lawyer. Okay? Now, who is allowed to act as substitutes in the absence of number 1 and number 2? Ang iisipin nyo dyan, in the absence of the parents, guardian, or nearest relative, o di naman kaya, in the absence of the LSWDO, we can allow the following as substitute. So, who can act as substitute? Number 1. Pwede si non-government organization representative. So, si NGO representative. Who else? Pwede rin yung member ng faith-based group. Okay, number 2, a member of a faith-based group. Or maybe, you go to the third one na pwede nating substitute, you have a member of the BCPC. If you say BCPC, it stands for Barangay Council for the Protection of the Child. Ang expectation natin, for every barangay, kailangan may BCPC sila. Para in case kailanganin ng substitute, they would be there to assist the child. Ma'am, ba't ganun? Ang trabaho ng tatlong yan is to assure that the rights of the child are actually protected. So they need to monitor that the rights of the child are protected, that the rights are respected, and that there should be no violation coming from the law enforcement. Okay? So yun ang rule natin Allowed ang substitute pero only for numbers 1 and number 2. Hindi pwede ang substitute ng lawyer. Okay? Next. Please do remember na whenever you conduct an interview, okay, whenever you conduct an interview, said interview should be friendly and non-intimidating. So I repeat, dapat friendly and non-intimidating. Kasi nga, di ba, it is an interview. Ma'am, paano pag hostile yung bata? Can we do interrogation? No. You can only conduct what you call an interview. Ma'am, saan kami magkakandak ng interview? It should be conducted in a separate room. In order to make the child feel comfortable and freely express himself, saan dapat mangyari yung interview? It should happen in a separate room. Kailangan i-exclude ninyo yung mga unnecessary people, most especially the media. Okay? Most especially the public. Kailangan i-exclude ang media, i-exclude ang public. As you now conduct the interview, na part ng initial invest, diba? As you now conduct the interview, you need to make sure that you are going to use simple and understandable language. Tapos take note, yung language na gagamitin ninyo should be a language understood by the child. Kasi, how can the child properly answer your questions if that child is not able to understand you? Paano kanya maiintindihan? Hindi naman niya alam yung lengguaheng pinagsasabi mo dyan. Okay, so the interview should be conducted in a language understood by a child, and you need to make sure that you need to use simple words. Okay? Now, ang iisipin ninyo lagi, the interview should be done in privacy. Okay? So, kailangan it should be done in private. Okay? Ma'am, bakit kailangan in private? Kasi, we are trying to avoid unnecessary interruptions. We're trying to avoid mga distractions. We're trying to avoid participation ng non-parties kasi these things now can make the child feel uncomfortable. Ngayon, itong initial investigation na to, di ba, gagamit siya ng interview. Yung interview na yon is oral. Okay? It's oral. Kailangan matranscribe yan into writing. So, ibig sabihin, yung interview which is oral should be documented. This interview should be converted into writing. So, what would happen? Ano man yung napag-usapan sa interview, kailangan mag-produce sila ngayon ng tinatawag natin na written form. Kaya magkakaroon ng written statement yung bata. So, yung interview, itatranscribe siya into writing. Yun yung written statement ng bata. Take note that in the written statement, pag mag-prepare ngayon yung nag-interview, yung WCPD, if they are going to prepare the written statement, that written statement should reflect the language used by the child. So, kung ano yung lengguwaheng ginamit ng bata during the interview, yun ang gagamitin nila ngayon dun sa written statement. It would be taken down in toto. Kung ano ang sinabi, kung ano ang lengguwahe, yun ang gagamitin. Ma'am, why? That would be for purposes of avoiding yung mga misunderstandings. Kasi, baka naman you are translating what the child have stated, pero mali yung translation mo. So, in order to avoid inaccuracies in the written statement, kasi hindi naman yung bata ang gagawa ng written statement eh. Ikaw yan na nag-interview. So, yung oral interview would now be transcribed into writing. Kung ano yung lengguwaheng ginamit ng bata, yun in toto ang gagamitin mo. Kung anong sinabi niya, yun mismo ang itra-transcribe mo. Okay? Now, if you are already done with the so-called written statement, you need to make the child sign the statement. Okay? So, kailangan may signing ng statement na yan for purposes of identification. If yung bata is illiterate, so no read, no write, or maybe if the child cannot sign, kasi ang requirement is he would sign, di ba? If the child could not sign kasi hindi siya marunong magsulat, kailangan magkaroon pa rin ng signature. Pero how would the child sign it? That would be via a thumb mark. Okay? So, maglalagay siya ng thumb mark niya doon that would now be in exchange of the signature. Kasi ang purpose naman ng signature is identification. Take note, mula doon sa interview hanggang sa pagpirma ng bata doon sa transcribed form or doon sa written statement niya, kailangan ma-witness yun nung tatlong persons na pinag-uusapan natin kanina na kailangang ma-notify. Ma'am, bakit? Kasi nga, di ba yun ang role nila? To assure that the rights of the child would be protected. So, what would happen? Ang sabi ng law natin, they need to witness the child, okay, put or affix his signature. Or maybe they need to witness the child putting his thumb mark. Okay? So, yun ang rule natin. Ngayon, pag tapos na yung signing, okay? So, tapos na yung interview kunyari, what would happen? Magkakaroon na tayo ng tinatawag nating referral for purposes of turnover. By the way, before we proceed with turnover, baka lang makalimutan ko ha, sa determination of age, I told you a while back that there is always a presumption of minority. So we now presume that the CICL is under 18 years old unless proven otherwise. So ang tanong, how would you be able to determine the age of the minor? Paano mo malalaman yung age niya? Of course, we need what you call your evidence. So, most often than not, ang titignan nila would be documentary evidence. Ano yung perfect example ng mga documentary evidences na yan? You have your birth certificate, you have your baptismal certificate, and of course, other pertinent documents just like your school records. Okay? Yan lang naman yung lumalabas lagi sa board exam. So, maliban pa daw sa birth certificate at baptismal certificate, ano pa daw ang pwede mong gamitin to prove the age of a child? Of course, you now have your school records. Usually sa board, mamimili ka lang doon sa choices kung saan dyan ang hindi pwedeng gamiting evidence, saan dyan ang pwedeng gamiting evidence. Okay? Now, in case there is no available documentary evidence, ano ang gagamitin natin to determine the age? Ang isipin nyo lang, pwede natin gamitin yung information coming from the child, yung sinasabi niya, yung physical appearance niya, tapos testimonies of people who know the person. Okay? So, information from the child, yung physical appearance niya, tapos testimonies of other people. And of course, kung meron pang ibang possible evidence na pwedeng mag-determine ng age ng tao. Okay? Now, ang isipin nyo, be very, very careful if you are talking about the information from the child or maybe the physical appearance. Kasi, there are cases that the child might lie. Okay? Just like one of my respondents sa masters ko before. He was claiming that he was already an adult, pero actually, he was only 16. Okay? So, he was claiming that he was an adult, although he's not. Ano pa ang titignan nyo? Physical appearance. You need to take into consideration na not all people would look the way they age. Okay? So, they do not really look the way they age. Ibig sabihin, yung itsura ng tao hindi sumasabay sa pagtanda niya. Kasi there are people who are still young pero they already look very old. Or maybe there are people who are already old pero they still look young. Okay? So be very careful about the determination of age. Aside from that, okay, yung report sa initial investigation, you need to record the following ha. Wala akong magagawa dito, you need to memorize. Kasi ang ginagawa lang dito is which among the following should be recorded, should not be recorded, mga ganon. So, record the following. You have there the use of handcuffs or maybe instruments of restraint. Ang isipin nyo lang dito sa instruments of restraint, this would pertain to devices that would now limit the activity of a person or the actions of a person. Okay? Ano pa yung i-record mo? Yung notice to the parents, the SWD, or maybe to the lawyer. So, were you able to notify them? If yes, well and good. If no, bakit? Measures taken to determine the age of the child. You also need to record that you ensured that the statements of the child was signed by the child and was witnessed by the personalities we have mentioned a while back. Tapos, you also need to record na nagkaroon ng search on the child, pero said search was conducted by an officer of the same gender. You need to record all of this. Ma'am, bakit? Provided ng law. Okay. Well, the child is under your custody kasi you have 8 hours eh. Okay, you have 8 hours. Ang isipin nyo, you are not allowed to detain the child. Ibig sabihin, you cannot put him inside jail, kahit lock-up jail pa yan. Kaya nga, if you would notice it, pag merong CICL under custody, ando doon lang siya sa admin office or maybe nakakalat-kalat lang siya doon sa station. Kasi you cannot put him inside jail. Next, you are not allowed to have a search by an officer of the opposite sex kasi gender sensitivity. Okay? Next, you need to avoid or you should not allow the child to have contact with adult offenders and offenders of the opposite sex. Alam na rin natin yan. You're not allowed to use vulgar language. Ibig sabihin, you should not harass the child. Bawal yun. Hindi mo pwede siyang murahin, hindi mo siya pwedeng i-discriminate or humiliate, hindi pwede ang mga yan. Okay? What else? You're not allowed to display your instruments of force or restraint. So, hindi mo pwedeng ipakita yung handcuff mo na nagdadangle dyan. Hindi mo pwedeng ipakita yung firearm mo. Ma'am, bakit ganun? Kasi nga, it might now cause psychological trauma to the child. And of course, yung pinakamahalaga, you are not allowed to use violence or unnecessary force over the child. Okay? Kasi if you do that, you might face criminal charges. So, let's talk about your turnover. Balikan na natin si turnover. Okay? Sabi natin, the law enforcers would be allowed only to have the child into custody for a period of not exceeding 8 hours. Hindi siya pwedeng lumampas. Kaya nga within the same 8 hours, kailangan ma-turn over yung bata. Regardless if nagkaroon na ba ng initial investigation, na-start na ba yung initial investigation, na-identify na ba or na-determine na ba yung age ng bata, we really don't care. So whether the initial investigation was started, whether it was completed or not, kailangan ma-turn over yung bata doon sa proper person. Ang tanong, kailan siya dapat mangyari? It should be conducted within the 8 hours na pinag-uusapan natin kanina pa. Now, kaninong turnover? That would be dependent on the age of the child. If the child is 15 years old and below, ibig sabihin age of absolute criminal irresponsibility. If the child is 15 years old and below, dahil wala na tayong pakialam if he acted with or without discernment, matik yan, the turnover would be to the parents. Kanino ito turnover ni law enforcer? Yung bata, pag 15 and below, sa parents. But, if the child is over 15 to under 18, ang turnover would be to the LSWDO for the preliminary determination of discernment. Okay? Preliminary determination of discernment, who does that? LSWDO. Dahil ang over 15 to under 18 is the age of conditional criminal responsibility, kailangan malaman if the child acted with or without discernment. So, kanino ang turnover? Doon kay LSWDO so that they would be able to determine if the child acted with or without discernment. You already know what is discernment, diba? Sabi natin, it is the mental capacity to know what is right from what is wrong. I repeat, it is the mental capacity to know what is right from what is wrong. Sino ang magdi-determine ng discernment? Ito lang iisipin nyo ha. Dalawa yan eh. Preliminary determination and final determination. So, yung determination ng discernment, dalawa lang yan. You have their preliminary determination, tapos yung isa, final determination. Yung tinatawag nating preliminary determination of discernment, it is conducted by the LSWDO. Ma'am, kailan kinakandak yun ng LSWDO? It happens during the initial investigation stage. So, doon pa lang sa stage ng initial investigation. Okay? Kahit na turnover na yung batang yan, still considered part of initial investigation yan eh. So, anong sabi? Yung LSWDO, dahil nga, preliminary pa lang naman yan, siya ang magdi-determine if the child acted with discernment. Kaya nga, diba, if the child is over 15 to under 18, ang turnover natin doon kay LSWDO. Now, is it already final? The answer is no. Preliminary lang siya. Recommendatory lang siya. Ma'am, bakit? Kasi, ang final determination of discernment is always done by your court. So now, pag sinabi ng court na merong discernment, kay sinabi ni LSWDO na wala, who would prevail? Court. Pag sinabi kunyari ng LSWDO na meron pero sinabi ni court, sinong magpre-prevail? Court. Ma'am, bakit? Final determination eh. Okay? Now, ang iisipin ninyo, the prosecutor does not have the responsibility of determining discernment. Hindi niya trabahong alamin if there was discernment. Ang trabaho niya is not to determine discernment but rather to prove to the court that there was discernment. I repeat for the last time. The prosecutor has no responsibility of determining probable cause. His function here is to prove to the court that indeed there was discernment. Okay? Kaya itong tinatawag yung prosecutor na to, hindi naman niya gawain or hindi niya kailangang alamin kung merong discernment. Kasi ang magdi-determine yan, LSWDO lang or maybe yung court. Ang trabaho niya actually is patunayan na, Your Honor, hello, meron pong nangyari, tapos the child acted with discernment. Okay? So, yun yung sinasabi ng discernment ninyo. Preliminary determination, tas final determination. Ngayon, if there was already a determination of discernment, pag-usapan natin si referral. Kanino mo i-refer yung case ng bata for us to know what should happen to this child. Okay? Take note, you are going to refer the child to the LSWDO for intervention, ha? Intervention. Kailan? If the child is 15 years old and below. Pinag-usapan natin to kanina sa age of criminal responsibility. Because 15 and below is the age of absolute criminal irresponsibility, ano ang sabi? They would only undergo intervention. So, kanino nyo sila i-refer? LSWDO for intervention. At the same time, pag yung tao is over 15 but under 18, tapos he acted without discernment. Again, kanino siya i-refer? LSWDO for intervention. On the other hand, if the child is over 15 to under 18 and he acted with discernment. Okay, he acted with discernment. Anong gagawin nyo? Pwede nyong i-refer yung case doon sa law enforcer or maybe sa LSWDO or maybe kay prosecutor or judge for the conduct of diversion. So, over 15, under 18 with discernment, anong mangyayari? Diversion ang mga yan. Saan pwedeng mangyaring diversion? Saan yung i-refer? The enforcement, LSWDO, o kaya naman kay prosecutor or judge. Ito yung mga venue ninyo for your diversion. Now, ang isipin ninyo, everything about the CICL, all records about the CICL should be considered confidential and private. Okay? So, there should be a maintenance of confidentiality and privacy. Kaya nga, lahat ng yan about the child, kailangan kept secret. Kaya nga, what do? You use a system of coding, gagamit ka ng separate logbook para hindi siya agad ma-access, you now exclude the public and all other unnecessary people, tapos, you are not allowed to give information about the child. Kaya diba, kung mapapansin nyo, pag merong CICL, kino-coveran sila ngayon ng jacket maybe, tas hinahide yung itsura nila. Kasi you need to protect the privacy of the child, kahit na CICL pa yan. Okay? Yan. Pag-usapan na natin si intervention program. Please do remember that your intervention program would refer to series of activities designed to address issues that cause the child to commit an offense. Ang iisipin nyo dito, the intervention program would now try to determine what's the problem. Why did the person commit a crime? Ano yung issues niya? So, you are going to look at the family background, socio-economic background. Titignan mo yung background ng bata. Bakit kaya siya nagkaganito? Ganyan ang intervention. What's the beauty of intervention? This type of program does not consider the CICL as a criminal, but rather, it now tries to consider the CICL as a victim. So, kumbaga ba, yes, the child committed a violation, pero this violation is not really his fault. Okay? He's also a victim of the situation. So, there are underlying reasons kung bakit niya nagawa to. So, anong gagawin sa intervention program? Aalamin ng intervention program what went wrong. Ma'am, bakit? So that the intervention program can provide or maybe address yung problem. Okay? So, what went wrong? What pushed you to do the crime? Pag nalaman yan, you would be able to provide a solution to said problem. Ngayon, itong intervention program na to, pwede siyang gawin ng national level or pwedeng local level. So, depende kung anong pinag-uusapan. Ang iisipin lang ninyo, if you are talking about the National Intervention Program, okay? Sino ang gumagawa niyan? You have the Juvenile Justice Welfare Council. Yung JJWC, that is actually what do you call it? It's actually a unit, or better, it is an agency created by the so-called RA 9344 for the enforcement of the provisions of RA 9344. Itong JJWC na to is required by the same law to make a national intervention program which shall be effective for a duration of 3 to 5 years. So pag ang JJWC, gagawa sila ng national intervention program, this intervention program should be usable or kailangan itong program na to magagamit siya for a period of 3 to 5 years. The National Intervention Program is considered as the mother or model program. So based dun sa mother or model program, itong National Intervention Program na to, magsaserve siya as basis, di ba? So from there, itong local government units, ipapattern nila yung local intervention program sa National Intervention Program. Kaya nga kung mapapansin niyo, ang different LGUs, meron silang magkakaibang intervention program. Pero despite the fact na magkakaiba sila, meron at merong similarity. Ma'am, bakit may similarity? Kasi ang pattern nila, ang basis nila is the National Intervention Program. Okay? Sinong gumagawa ng local intervention program? That would be your local government units. Tanong, gaano katagal ang validity or duration ng local intervention program? Ma'am, 3 years. Okay? Ma'am, bakit 3 years? Kasi malamang, di ba, kung iisipin ninyo yung mga barangays ninyo, gaano ba katagal ang term of office ni na mayor, di ba? Ni na punong barangay. Syempre, you have their 3 years. So, ang expectation talaga pag local intervention program, okay, 3 years lang siya. Okay? Saan siya nakapattern? National Intervention Program. Who makes a local intervention program? LGU. National Intervention Program, JJWC. Now, alam na natin to eh. Who would be undergoing intervention? Alam na natin. Siyempre, those people who are exempt from criminal liability. Ma'am, sino na ulit sila? 15 years old and below. Or maybe number 2, over 15 to under 18 who acted without discernment. And of course, yung pangatlo, those who committed status offenses. Kasi di ba ang status offenses are not really crimes. Nagkataon lang na because they were committed by minors, it now becomes wrong. Pero pag adult naman, okay lang siya. Di ba? And of course, per intervention na ang iisipin nyo, yes, they are exempt from criminal liability, pero there is always civil liability to be borne by the parents or the guardian. I have already discussed this part doon sa definition of terms natin. So, procedure tayo ha ng intervention. So, pag yung bata is 15 years old and below, anong sabi? That child should be turned over immediately to the parents or maybe guardian, di ba? Now, pag ginawa mo yung turnover na yan, the turnover should be done with notice to the LSWDO to determine ano ba yung appropriate program for this child, tapos ano ba yung appropriate program para dun sa parent. Tapos kailangan mailagay din doon sa notice sa LSWDO if the child belongs to your DAN. Ma'am, ano yung DAN? Dysfunctional family ba siya? Abandoned child ba siya? Neglected child ba siya? So, kailangan malaman natin yun. Ma'am, bakit kailangang malaman yun? Kasi that would be the basis kung ano ba yung appropriate program para sa batang yan. Now, in case nagkaroon ng intervention, pero yung bata suwail, ang sarap tuktukan. Okay? The child does not want to comply with the intervention. Si LSWDO, pwede siyang mag-file for involuntary commitment. Okay? So, imagine, yung LSWDO ninyo, magfa-file siya ng involuntary commitment. Ma'am, bakit ganon? Because the child does not want to comply with this intervention program. Punta na tayo sa diversion. Guys ang iisipin nyo sa intervention, the child, the CICL, is also a victim. So we do not consider him as an offender. We do not make him feel liable. What we need to do is to determine what went wrong, Why? Because the child, the CICL, is also a victim of the situation. So next tayo, you have what you call your diversion. Your diversion is an alternative, child-appropriate process of determining the responsibility and treatment of a CICL. So, you already know, nasabi natin kanina dun sa first part, na ang diversion ninyo is considered as an alternative or maybe a suspension of the juvenile proceedings. Kasi possible na wala pang naka-file. So, imbis na mag-file, try mo na yung diversion. Or possible din na ang nangyari is meron nang na-file, pero isuspend muna natin, itry muna nating magkaroon ng diversion. Take note that in your diversion, you now make the child or you now make the CICL feel responsible. You make him responsible for him to know the consequences of his actions. Unlike intervention that you treat the CICL as a victim, sa diversion natin, hindi ganun. For your diversion, you need to make the child feel responsible for the consequences of his act. Kasi under diversion, di ba, the child acted with discernment. He knew that what he did was wrong. So you need to make him understand the consequences of his wrongful act. Okay? Now, your diversion, just like your intervention, would be based on the social, cultural, economic, psychological, or maybe the educational background of the child. We do not want to resort to formal court proceedings, kaya nga tinatry pa rin natin ang diversion. Now, kilala na natin, di ba, kung sino yung mga nag-undergo ng diversion. By the way, before I forget, ang diversion ninyo is otherwise known as your tertiary intervention. So if you cannot find the word diversion, anong hahanapin nyo? You try to find tertiary intervention. Okay? So, okay. Saan mangyayari ang diversion? So, meron tayong venue sa. By the way, do not forget, venue is the geographical location or the place where you exercise jurisdiction. I repeat. It is the place or the geographical location where you exercise jurisdiction. That's your venue. So, short to say, sa venue of diversion, saan ba dapat mangyari or saan ba dapat makandak or sino ba ang dapat magkandak ng diversion ninyo? Ang iisipin nyo, the basis of the venue of diversion would be the imposable penalty for the crime committed. If the crime committed has an imposable penalty of 6 years and below, ibig sabihin, nasa anong level siya? Kung magfa-file ka sana sa court, anong level? Nasa first level court. Nasa MTC level siya kasi 6 years and below. Pag 6 years and below yan, yung imposable penalty for the crime committed, ibig sabihin, MTC jurisdiction sana siya kung nagkaroon ng filing ng case. The venue of the diversion could be sa barangay, pwedeng sa police, or maybe pwedeng sa prosecutor level. Kailan ulit barangay, police, prosecutor level ang venue? That happens if the imposable penalty for the crime committed is 6 years. So, pag yung crime, jurisdiction ng MTC, saan ulit ang diversion? Barangay, police, prosecutor level. But, if the imposable penalty for the crime is above 6 years, ibig sabihin na sa prison mayor going up tayo. Ibig sabihin, kung nagkaroon sana ng filing ng case, RTC jurisdiction to. Kung RTC jurisdiction siya, meaning pag over 6 years ang imposable penalty, ang diversion ninyo would be in your court. So, court diversion ang mangyayari. Take note venue of diversion, tignan nyo. 6 years and below, barangay, police, prosecutor. Pag above 6 years siya, that would be your court. Please don't forget that pag ang pinag-uusapan natin is diversion, kailangan meron kayong contract of diversion. So, because it is a contract, ibig sabihin, nagkaroon ng agreement between the CICL and his victim. Now, ano yung content ng contract of diversion? The contract of diversion mandates that the child admit voluntarily that he committed the act. Okay? I repeat, in the contract of diversion, the child should admit voluntarily that he committed the act. After the child admits the commission of said act, kailangan si victim at si CICL would have an agreement that the CICL would be undergoing the diversion. Now, part ng contract na yon would be a promise that the child would be reporting to the LSWDO at least once a month. I repeat, part ng contract of diversion, yung requirement na itong si CICL magre-report siya kay LSWDO ilang beses, at least once a month. Para kang probationer, di ba? Si probationer, once a month, kailangan mag-report kay PPO. Ganun din si CICL. Pag nag-undergo siya ng diversion, kailangan mag-report siya kay LSWDO at least once a month. Ngayon, part din ng contract of diversion na pag itong si CICL would fail to comply with the requirements of diversion, what would happen? The diversion now would be cancelled, or maybe the diversion now would no longer push through and a case na would be filed against him. Magkakaroon na tayo ng formal judicial proceedings against the CICL. Magkakaroon na ng juvenile proceedings na tinatawag natin. Okay? So take note for every diversion, laging may contract of diversion. Required in the contract that the CICL would voluntarily admit that he committed the crime. At dapat pumayag si victim na itong si CICL mag-undergo ng diversion. Kasi, if the victim would not give his or her consent, kahit na gusto ni CICL na mag-diversion, hindi siya pwedeng mangyari. Kasi, the diversion should be agreed upon by the victim. The victim should give consent. Now, ang iisipin ninyo, yung diversion program natin, di ba, nakabase siya sa diversion contract. So, ibig sabihin, for us to have proof, for us to have evidence, kailangan itong diversion program na nilalaman ni diversion contract should be written. Tapos, this diversion contract should also be signed by the parties and the concerned authorities. Ang iisipin ninyo, ang diversion program should be completed within 45 days. So, anong expectation natin? Ang diversion would be for how long? 45 days. Ngayon, there are cases whereby walang nangyaring diversion dahil ayaw ng victim or di naman kaya nag-fail yung diversion. If that's the case, magkakaroon tayo ngayon ng continuation or maybe magkakaroon tayo ng filing ng formal juvenile proceedings against the CICL. So, magkakaroon ngayon ng trial, di ba? In case the CICL was found guilty. So, anong sabi? Guilty siya. Ang gagawin ng court is, hindi niya i-pronounce yung judgment. So, there would be no promulgation of judgment. Why? Kasi magkakaroon ng automatic suspension of sentence. So, in your automatic suspension of sentence, the moment a CICL is found guilty, there would be no promulgation of judgment, but rather, ang gagawin ng court, ang gagawin ng court is, isususpend niya ngayon yung sentence. Ibig sabihin, the CICL would not go and serve his sentence. Okay? Pag nagkaroon ng suspension of sentence. So, ma'am, anong mangyayari sa kanya? This child now would be undergoing rehabilitation program pa rin naman para siyang diversion program. Okay? Parang ita-try ulit nila kasi the person is still young. Pero take note etong suspension of sentence na to would still recognize yung tinatawag natin na credit time allowance. Kumbaga ba, kung ang pinag-uusapan sana natin would be adult offenders, preventive imprisonment, di ba? Pero dahil minor to, magkakaroon tayo ng full credit of time in detention. Kasi take note, while awaiting the decision of the court, this CICL would be staying doon sa tinatawag nating bahay pag-asa, di ba? Yung dating tinatawag natin na youth detention home. So, kung ano man yung time served niya doon, ikre-credit yun para ma-deduct ngayon doon sa tinatawag natin na sentence niya sana. Okay? So, anong mangyayari? Instead of promulgating the judgment of conviction, ano ang gagawin ng court? Magkakaroon ng automatic suspension. Pero take note, there is no automatic suspension of sentence if the imposable penalty is reclusion perpetua, life imprisonment, or death. Walang automatic suspension of sentence. Ngayon, ang iisipin nyo, if the child, okay, was found guilty, tapos nagkaroon ng automatic suspension of sentence. Itong batang to would be going back to the court pag nag-18 siya. So, pag nag-18 siya, yung batang yan, babalik siya sa court. Tapos, the court na would try to determine if effective ba yung ina-undergo niya na rehabilitation. Ang possible na mangyari dyan is yung court, pag hindi pa rin siya satisfied, pwede niyang i-extend ngayon yung rehabilitation na yun hanggang 21. So, papabalikin ulit siya. The moment he strikes 21, babalik ulit siya para malaman ni court, okay ka na ba? Effective ba? May changes ba? Pag na-determine ng court na, hindi pa rin siya okay, pasaway pa rin siya, that's the time now that the court would require the CICL. Dating CICL, ngayon adult na siya eh. The court now would require this person to serve his sentence. Okay? He would now be incarcerated kasi imaginein mo, pinagbigyan ka na, sinuspending sentence mo pero ungas ka pa rin. Okay? So, ganun ang nangyayari in cases of suspension of sentence. So, aftercare services, please do remember that this process was introduced by your Borstal institution. Okay? So, kung naalala ninyo, the Borstal institution is regarded as the best reformatory school for juveniles. Sila yung nag-introduce ng tinatawag natin na aftercare services. Ma'am, anong nangyayari sa aftercare services? The CICL was already dismissed due to good behavior. Ibig sabihin, the person was already discharged from rehabilitation. When you say discharged, ibig sabihin, he is now being released from rehabilitation. So, pag yung batang yan, pag yung CICL na yan was already discharged because he possessed good behavior, di ba? So, ni-recommend ngayon na ma-release na siya. Pag na-discharge na yung CICL na yan, the LSWDO would be monitoring the CICL. The LSWDO would be conducting surprise visits para ma-determine if nako-continue ba yung rehabilitation mula doon sa rehabilitation center palabas doon sa community. Kasi ang fear natin, baka naman after the person is discharged from the rehabilitation center, baka naman this minor would already stop in the rehabilitation. Baka naman tong minor na to bumalik na naman sa dati. So in order to assure that the rehabilitation would continue even after discharge, the LSWDO would be conducting visits and monitoring for a period of 6 months after discharge. Anong tawag natin dyan sa monitoring na yan? That is what you call your aftercare services. Okay? Anong nag-introduce niyan? You have there your Borstal institution. Okay? So, yun lang siya ha. So, yun lang yung juvenile delinquency natin. So, thank you guys and then God bless for your board examination.